All right, welcome back to You're Absolutely Right, the hallucination free podcast where two principal engineers talk about software, tech, and life. I'm Scott, and this is Wes. Wes, what's happening?
Not a whole lot. Just getting ready to take some time off, hopefully, for the vacation holidays coming up. So I'm looking forward to that. But got a lot to do before then.
Yeah, nice. Are you taking time off like Christmas and New Year's?
Yeah, usually. And we go see my family for Christmas, and we'll be here for my wife's family. But how about y'all? Y'all got a lot
Nice.
planned?
I don't have anything planned for December, except I will definitely be taking some time off. So,
Yeah,
yeah, we'll see. Probably do a little ski trip in January or February too.
nice. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so today we're going to talk about LLM context. So we're going to do kind of a deep dive. We're going to talk about what LLM context is for the uninitiated. We're going to talk about how it works, and we're going to talk about some of our issues that we've been working through lately. Wes is going to talk a bit about tools. We can get into MCP. All this stuff is sort of related to context. So if you're not familiar, LLM context is basically everything that you pass to the LLM. So if you think about everything that you have a system prompt, which is like the instructions, you have conversation history, which would be like user prompt, assistant responses, tools, tool calls, things like that. And then anything else that you add into there, that's all LLM context. So everything that you send goes into something called the context window. And the context window is like the maximum amount of tokens that an LLM can process at one time. And it's always limited. And so some of these context windows are large, but the more you put in there, the worse the model performs. So another thing to remember is all that stuff that you're adding into there changes all of the outputs. So if you put a long document in there, it may stop calling your tools correctly or forget some system instructions or something like that. So Torsten Ball wrote an article recently on AMP where he said everything in the context window has an influence on the output. So even if some words and tokens have more influence than others, but everything counts to some extent. That's why you don't want to have text in your context window that you don't want to influence the result. Quality degrades. The more context, the worse the results. Most models provide better results with less context. So your job is to give the LLM the right context at the right time and nothing more to get the best outputs. So this is a push and pull that we're constantly fighting. And because you want to put in as much instructions as you can in the system prompt to make the model do what you want it to do. And then you want to add in a bunch of tools. And then you want those tools to be able to go fetch data. So if we want to answer a question about our company, we want to go look up the company documentation to make sure that we get the right answer. So when you do that, you actually fetch the document and you put it into the context. And then if you have multiple tool calls and lots of different contexts and lots of different things you want to do, you can imagine that this context window gets filled up pretty quickly. And even though in like Gemini 1.5 Pro allows 1.5 million tokens in its context window, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to perform well with large amounts of context. So what I'm personally finding in my work is that there's this like scope creep. So you start with an assistant that's kind of small, or a conversation, an app with an LLM that's kind of small and does a few things. But then as you go along, you add more things. You find edge cases where it doesn't do what you want it to do. So you add examples in the system prompt to stop it from doing that, to do the right thing. And then as you go along, you just get more and more and more of this. And then it gets to a point where it's just too much. Like it stops, it starts dropping instructions. It starts it stops using tools correctly. And so there's this balance of finding the right amount of context so that your app performs correctly and does what you want it to do. But then also, how do you add on features and continue to develop your application in a way that works?
Right. And you're doing this from building an agent perspective, where you're building the tools that an agent would use to perform specific actions. But this all pertains to any AI usage, right? Regardless of whether you're chatting on chatgpt.com, or you're using a coding agent to build an application, or you're building your own agent that is going to have its own tools and everything. Like, it's still, you're going to be up against this context wall regardless. And I think that wall is going to keep getting higher and higher, further and further away. Like you said, there's models out there with million um, token windows, but it's still, that's not going to solve the problem, right? At some point, I think it's probably going to be like, it doesn't, the token or the context window doesn't matter. You can shove in as many tokens as you want to, but it's still going to direct the output. But what is, like, explain a token? Like, what is a token? We say token and we say context. I think we've explained what a context window is pretty well, but like, we can say words or everything that you shove into it or how many tokens. Like, what is a token exactly?
Yeah, so it's a part of a word. So it's not a
Yeah.
character and it's not a word, but it's a part of a word. But it's easy to think of it as like just characters or words. It's all kind of, it's not how it really works, but I think it's okay to just think of it like that.
Right. I mean, it's words broken down in a way that the LLM can then understand it and parse it and infer it, whether that be characters or words or whatever. But yeah, you don't really have to know truly what a token is, but that's how your context window is measured, is by the number of tokens that are sent to the LLM. Um, and that usually correlates to the larger amount of words that you're shoving in.
Yeah. And for the people who maybe aren't super familiar with it, if you think of what we're doing with an LLM, we're sending text in and we're getting text out. And that sounds simplistic, but something that really helped my mental model, when you start talking about more complex things like memory and conversation history and tools and retrieval augmented generation and context, all this stuff is just text. So you can think of going to ChatGPT and typing in a question. And then let's say you ask what the weather is in your area. ChatGPT doesn't know what the weather is because it was trained on data, that's not today. So what it has to do is it has to go figure out what the answer to that question is by calling a tool. So it'll have like let's say it has a web search tool. It can search the web and find an answer to that question or hit a weather API or whatever. But you can think of it as go to weather.com, copy and paste the weather data for today, paste it into ChatGPT, and then send the prompt with your question and the weather data, and it will give you the correct response. And that's what's actually happening when we do this programmatically, except we will put that weather data into the system prompt instead of in a user prompt, and we'll do it on the fly.
Right.
But you can imagine the same thing happens with your tool definitions and with, like, say you go get documentation, things like
Right.
that.
Or
It's
logs or anything like that. Yeah. Because
anything.
the LLM gets infinitely better the more information you give it and the more context you give it, when that context is explicitly applicable to the problem that you're trying to solve. And so I even run into this a lot when I'm using a coding agent. I'll give it a lot of logs to look at and parse to figure out what might be going wrong or whatever. But then that quickly uses up my context window because I'm just giving it a dump of logs. And so I need to find what the problem is, but not keep working on the problem in that same session with an agent. I need to go move and create another session that creates another context window that I can then say, okay, here's the exact problem. And then I can hand it the file, because then it's not going to get confused by massive amounts of other logs that maybe might have other issues in it or just other things that it doesn't even need to worry about, right? So there's just this now the mental model of knowing when and how you should be creating new sessions with agents or LLMs to better manage that context and know when you should stop and know when you should start something else.
Yeah, and I think you're referring specifically to coding agents. One of the issues that I'm having in a multi-agent system that's not for coding is that you have this sort of scope creep of what your base agent needs to be able to do. And at a certain point, you need to divide those responsibilities among specialist agents. And so let's say you are doing some type of like trip planning agent. And at a certain point, you have maybe it plans an itinerary for you, but then you need it to go book a car rental, and then you need to book a hotel, and then you need to look up nearby attractions, and then, et cetera, et cetera. And it never really ends. So you need to divide these up into discrete agents. And so an LLM works best when it has a single responsibility or at least a discrete set of responsibilities that are related. that it can focus on, and then you use other specialized agents for these other tasks. But the problem is, it's really hard to build multi-agent systems. So you can have these things like handoffs, or you can basically use one agent to call another agent, either as a tool or through like A to A, or just completely hand it off, so that you're actually talking with this other agent instead. But it gets really difficult to pass context along between all the agents. And what you find is that when you create specialist agents, you actually want the conversation to be sort of something that flows and that feels like you're talking to one person the whole time. Not that you're being passed off between these agents into where it's kind of like the old telephone thing where you call people and you're like, it's like, how can I help you? Well, I'm having a problem with my account. Here's my account number. Okay, great. I have to transfer you. Then it's like, hi, how can I help you? What's your account number? It's like, I just told the guy my account number. Like, why do I have to tell you to you again?
You end up back with the original guy not knowing how to solve a problem. Yeah.
And even like they make you punch in your account number first, and then they transfer you to a person who's like, what's your account number? I'm like, I just punched it in. So you have this same problem with multi-agent systems where maybe the conversation, maybe the tone of one agent is a little bit different. Maybe they don't have quite the same context. Maybe you want one agent to be like a conversational agent, and then the other agent is like just a booking agent, so you can use it as a tool. These things get very complex very quickly, and understanding when to hand off, when to hand back, when to use an agent as a tool, when not to, is a very difficult problem to solve right now. And I don't know of any, I mean, I'm sure there's people that are solving this problem, but even the very well-funded projects like Copilot, for example, it's not using an agent. It does not hand off dynamically to other agents. And even like AMP, which we're both fans of, has maybe like a couple agents it can use for very specific, like almost keyword-based use cases. It's like use the Oracle, use the librarian. It's not, it's doing very little automatically.
Yeah, and business-based agents aren't keying off of very specific keywords because a merchant doesn't, or like a customer, the user doesn't know how to do that, to trigger every single agent that your main agent might have. And so it's kind of your responsibility as the creator of the agent to know how that is and to try to give the information to each agent to know when it should hand off based on common conversations that user's having with the chat. And so that's a lot more difficult to do. And the way that I've seen it done is just through system prompts for each agent, which feels very, I don't know about brittle, but very just like a shot in the dark. I hope this system prompt's going to be good enough to give this next agent the information that it needs to be able to do that. But it still seems fickle because I've seen sometimes where like the main agent thinks it has access to some tools that this other agent has. And so it tries to call it, then it's like, oh, wait, I don't have those. I need to go talk to this other agent that actually has those. And so you kind of see that little mental blip that it has where it doesn't have enough context of the entire system of agents to really to know how to seamlessly hand things off. And so, I mean, are there any other ways besides system prompts when you do give that handoff to solve that? Or is that really the primary way of doing it at this point?
Well, yeah, so you can have like persistent conversation storage, and then each agent has access to that conversation. You can also do like rolling summaries and use that to hand off so that the agent kind of understands the summary of the conversation up to that point without reading through all of it. And then you can also just have them have kind of unified APIs or MCP servers where they can go fetch data about the customer, about the session, or whatever. But even with all of those things, it's still very difficult to have proper orchestration where you hand off, at the correct time, it hands back at the correct time, all the tools are being used properly, all that kind of stuff. So, another thing I've been considering is actually supervised fine tuning. So instead of let's say you have the problem where you have a very complex kind of like branching workflow where it's like lots of just different scenarios, edge cases. Like if a customer mentions this, you should maybe talk about this concept. And in other cases, maybe they purchased this product but not this other product, so you should mention this instead, something like that. I'm thinking about actually trying the supervised fine tuning route, because you can only cover so many examples in your system prompt. And then that type of thing is not like, you could have separate agents for each scenario, but it gets so hard to orchestrate the agents that at that point it doesn't even really solve the problem. It kind of makes the problem more complex.
Makes it worse. Yeah.
So the supervised fine tuning thing I'm really interested in, which is where you can provide a data set to an existing, like OpenAI lets you do this. You provide a data set and you can tune any of their models, and you can basically give it behaviors, not specifics. Like you don't want specific facts and numbers and things that can change. You still use RAG for that, but you can change its behavior in such a way that you can remove a lot of your examples that you were stuffing in your system prompt. And so that frees up your system prompt a little bit to be a little bit more focused. So I'm hoping that that's going to help.
So how do those behaviors get into the LLM? Like, is it
the training,
a tool?
Through the supervised fine tuning.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
it actually does this like post training on one of their models. Like you can choose any of them, like GPT 5.1. And then it will give you a new model with your training in it. And so if your data set is good, hopefully you've influenced it enough to be able to do those behaviors you've trained it in. I think there's some subtlety to it and some things that I'm going to find out about it as we go through this process, but it'll be interesting to try it out.
Yeah. Give me an example of a behavior that you would train it for. Like, and like, how do you continually keep training this model?
Yeah. So, okay. Well, a dumb example is like talk like a pirate, and here's how pirates talk. Like, they say "our matey" and blah, blah, blah. And then you feed it all that data, and now it understands how to talk like a pirate. In a maybe like a business use case, it would be like, if a customer is asking these types of questions, here's an example of a good conversation of what like a good support person did and what route they took. And you want to avoid putting in specific things, because let's say you say, hey, our fees are X amount, and then your fees change. Like you don't want that stuck in the model training. But yeah, I actually don't know, because we haven't done it yet. But the idea is that you train the behaviors, and then you can remove some examples from your system prompt, and hopefully
so you're almost like
more focused,
defining like user flows. And
it's conversations. You give it. You're like, here's a bunch of conversations that are exactly how I want it to go. And you just have a bunch of examples, and then it's trained to be like, okay, if the conversation goes this direction, that's kind of how I'm supposed to be responding.
I see. Okay. Well, cool. I mean, that could be exciting, and I can see how that'd be beneficial. But I mean, I'm sure everything has its pros and cons.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to try out, at least.
Yeah. So what are you doing? Like, that's a lot of agent context management. What are some tools and tricks that you're using for managing context with like your coding agents, or just any other LLM that you're interacting with, to ensure you're getting accurate, helpful usage out of it?
Well, one of the things that just came out recently was this article from Anthropic about code execution with MCP. And this piggybacks on the Cloudflare article, which was a similar topic. But basically, they're talking about how to use code execution instead of MCPs. So I'm talking around your question, but it kind of is answering it.
I know.
Basically...
Well, explain MCP first, just to make sure everybody's on the same page with that. Because I think we said MCP, but people may not actually know what it is.
Sure. Okay. So when you provide tools to your model, so let's say we in the weather API example, if you ask an LLM, what's the weather? It needs to be able to go fetch the weather data, because it doesn't have that information. So you can give it a tool, let's call it web search. And then you instruct the LLM, hey, go use the web search tool when you need to find any like relevant data or like
Mm-hmm.
timely information. So then when the LLM is asked, what's the weather? It's going to say, hey, I don't know, but I have this web search tool. I should use this. And then it returns that information to us. It says, use the web search tool. And here's like the search term that you should use. Like, what's the weather for today in, Scranton, Pennsylvania or whatever. So the LLM does not call that tool for you. You call that tool. So it says
Right.
you need to call the web search tool. So you call that web search tool. And then you give the result back and you say the weather in Scranton is, 75 degrees and sunny. And then you run that through the LLM again. And so it says, here's the user question. Here's the tool that was called and the result from that. Now answer the user's question. So MCP, so before it's MCP, one way to do that is to just define this function locally. So you have a web search function. When you see that the LLM tells you to call the web search tool, you call your web search function, you go to the weather API, you return the result, you run it through the LLM again. MCP
Which is a valid
way
approach.
yeah, certainly. And I use this a lot, almost exclusively, actually. We could talk about pros and cons, but MCP is a way to say, hey, we have lots of teams in our organization or across the world that want to use web search functionality. We should build it in a way that everyone can use it. So MCP is a way to say, here's this web search tool. We're going to put it somewhere your LLM understands how to use it. So you call the MCP server to list the tools. It says, hey, I have a web search tool. Now you do the same thing. You send that through to the LLM. It says, call the web search tool. Now, instead of calling our web search function locally, we call the MCP server and we say, hey, MCP server, you do the web search and give me the results.
Right.
So that's MCP.
Yeah. So really, it's a way to be able to define a way for LLMs to call any data provider out there with a common schema. And that's what MCP really is. It's a common schema for anybody to be able to integrate with, to be able to expose their data to an LLM. And then the LLM would know how to call it automatically because you adhere to that common schema. And like you said, yeah, there's pros and cons to it. But yeah, anyway, let's move forward with what you were saying about MCP. Sorry to cut it off, but I think that was pretty helpful to go down what an MCP is.
No, that's okay. So this article from Anthropic is talking about using MCPs. So the way you use an MCP, let's say instead of web search, you also have like 12 other tools on there that do a bunch of other things. When you call an MCP server to list the tools, it gives you all of them. And then you put all of them into your LLM context window, which, hey, everybody knows what a context window is now because we just talked about it. So that goes into your context window. And then your LLM has to decide how to call those tools. So let's say, for example, you have like get document and then you have add to Salesforce, which is kind of like the example they used.
Right.
So what the LLM will do is if you say, hey, I don't know, get my document and add it to Salesforce, bad example, but the LLM will go, okay, cool. I'm going to call the get document tool and it returns the full document text, right? Let's say it's really long.
Right.
All of that document text goes into your LLM context window. You know what a context window is now. So then it calls the Salesforce tool, add this to Salesforce. It then has to send all of that data to Salesforce. So it has to pass all the document data to your add to Salesforce tool. So it's basically passing around these giant chunks of data in the LLM context window. So that eats up a bunch of tokens. And as we were talking about, this degrades model performance and all that kind of stuff. The alternative they're suggesting is instead you could have an LLM write code based on your MCP server and then execute that code. So an example of this would be instead of calling get document and passing the full document text and then calling add to Salesforce, you would write a function that gets the document and adds it to Salesforce and then just like returns a result like success equals true. So that then your LLM could call that function instead, and then none of the document text goes into your LLM context window. The only thing that goes in is the result of the function execution, which is like success true, here's the ID or something like that.
So what's the difference between a tool just calling an API and that?
So the difference is these tools are hosted on an external MCP server and you want to use those tools. you don't actually get to see the code that the tool was, how it was written, right? So let's say there's a get document tool and an upload to Salesforce tool. You don't know how those are written, so you could rewrite those and bring those in locally, but that's a whole different concept. What they're saying is let the LLM decide what to do. Let the LLM write the code to combine those two things. So it still calls the MCP invocation mode of the tool or method of the tool. It just
Okay.
wraps it in a function. So instead
I
of
see.
saying get the document, pass it into the LLM context, it just writes a function that just gets the document, passes it right to Salesforce. So the document context never goes into the context window.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, basically, the LLM's deciding the behavior that needs to happen, not necessarily being forced down the specific tool chain workflow that needs to happen. And so then it could just say, oh, you know what? I know I need to do these multiple functions. It makes sense to put them together into one upload document function that it knows it has to go retrieve the data and then upload it to Salesforce instead of having to call two separate MCPs. And so you're letting the LLM kind of be the orchestrator in that sense versus giving it I don't know, multiple tools to choose from that it has to call in a specific order.
Right. Yeah. So it's understanding what tools are available, and then it thinks if I write this code, it'll be faster. It still calls those
Okay.
tools just in a different way. I mean, this is assuming that we can somehow have LLMs writing and executing code arbitrarily
Right.
in production, which is I mean, I guess they're doing it now with ChatGPT. They have like a Python sandbox where it can write code for you. So I guess it can be done. To me, that's just a security nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like a research study to determine the most accurate way of working with MCPs, but it may not be the most developer friendly, beneficial way of working with MCPs,
Well, it's not
or the safest, or
enterprise.
the
It's not enterprise
right.
production ready. Yeah, I don't think.
Yeah, it's like it feels more theoretical than like applicable at this point. Maybe it's not, but to me, building a real world product, trying to figure out how to execute these functions safely and securely, and like giving that LLM execution capabilities seems like much more of a headache than what business leaders are going to want out of a product that you might be an agent that you might be building at work or something, right? They'll be like, no, that's too much work. You can call the tools. It just may not be as good. And maybe that's the question then of like, what provides the better output of having better tools or having the LLM smart enough to define what tools need to be called, create a wrapper function around it and calling it. So I don't know. It feels like a just I don't know. It feels like one of those things where there's no right answer, really.
Yeah.
Still, like right
Well,
because
I think what you would do in like our case in enterprise production code is you would know in advance what use cases you want, and you would not be like calling external MCP servers when you don't know what the tools are and then formulating this code on the fly. You would just write that stuff in advance, and you would
right,
already have a tool that like gets a document and uploads it to Salesforce, and you would just call that tool internally.
right. I think that's where my mind was initially. I was like, what's the difference between a tool that just calls some APIs? And because that's what I'm writing right now is I'm writing tools that call some APIs, and I don't need an MCP server, and I can bundle API calls together to do the behavior that I'm trying to perform versus having to work with a very strict set of tools that some other provider has exposed that doesn't necessarily work in the way that I need to.
Yeah, and I think that gets into the pros and cons of MCP. I have not been using MCP much internally because all of the tools I'm writing only need to be used by my agent. And so
Mm,
MCP is really when you want to externalize your tools so that other teams and other people can actually use those tools. But it is a lot of overhead. And then you run into these problems like we're talking about, where then you might have these generic MCP tools because other people need to use them, not just you.
Right.
So then you can't write them exactly the way you want it to execute.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that brings up that, like, I think maybe companies are going to be easy to expose MCP servers that are just a replica of their APIs, especially their RESTful APIs, and that's probably not best the best practice to do because of what we're talking about. Like, it's a whole lot easier to expose tools, or beneficial maybe to expose an MCP server that exposes behaviors that should happen on that provider. Like, an example being, like, instead of having a list tool and a create tool for like scheduling events, you might instead just want to expose a schedule event where it would list to see if there's any available spots, and then find that there are, and then schedule that event for that available spot, instead of having two tools of like that the LLM is responsible for checking if it's available and then knowing it needs to then go call and schedule the tool. Because that's some of the problems I've seen with tools, is being able to appropriately have it follow a specific workflow. And that, for one, if you need it to like call one tool in this order, maybe to authenticate, then call another tool to list something, then call another tool to create something, or to validate that something exists before you create something, you end up shoving a lot of data in your system prompts for that agent that says, this is how these tools should be called. But then you're assuming that all of your users are going to be in that one specific uh, like state, right? That maybe they already have it or they don't have it. But hopefully you have a lot of users that are going to be in a lot of different states that you're never going to be able to fully account for every scenario in your system prompt to ensure that your tools follow a specific workflow. And so I think it's important to think about the behaviors that your tools should accomplish on your platform and expose that, versus just CRUD operation tools, or read operation tools that may not actually be how an LLM should interact with your service as well.
Yeah. I'd also say this is a tricky one, because if you bundle your tools too much, you'll
Yep.
find that you actually still need some of those atomic operations, like you were saying, scheduling. You may run into an issue where you actually need a tool that just lists the events, or that does those one-off things. And if you
Agreed.
try to orchestrate it too much, you'll actually stop yourself from using it, or other people from using it a way that they need it.
Hmm.
So
I agree.
you kind of have to know what you're doing in advance and then build it for that.
Right. And I think one good example is maybe like, also it's important to know how you're naming the tools and describing them to the LLM, right? So if you have like a list tool, or a fetch, or just if you call it like get products or something like that, well, that tool might also actually be able to search and filter and do all that stuff. But just saying get products doesn't really infer the ability to filter and stuff. But if you name your tool search products instead, well, that infers you're going to get a list of products back, right? For one, but it also infers that the LLM is able to use that tool for more than just listing a static um, list of products or something like that. So I think it's important to ensure that you might have to have those atomic tools, but also thinking about how they're named, how they're described, and realizing that that is one of the ways that an LLM infers what tools should be called and how they should be called and when they should be called. And that, just again, replicating your CRUD RESTful API of get, read, create, update, delete may not be the best naming solution that you want to give to your LLM agent as well.
Yeah. And a couple more tips from my personal experience is a lot of times you need the tool description, but the tool description itself is sometimes not sufficient for the model to understand how to actually use that tool. And instead of stuffing more information into the tool description, I usually put in the system prompt, here are your tools, here's how you're supposed to use them. with a longer explanation. And I've found that that helps quite a bit with helping the model use the tools correctly. Another thing is the more tools you have, the more you have in your context. And as we learned that the model performance degrades with more in your context. So one thing that you can do to help with that is you can use tools in a more generic way. So let's say you have a product tool. Instead of having a get products tool, a create products tool, a search products tool, a delete products tool, all that stuff, you actually have one product tool. And then in the parameters, you actually give it a get, create, update, delete, or whatever your actions are. And then in your tool invocation method, you just look for the action parameter and then you do like a switch statement based on that. And that allows you to, you can basically have more tools and the LLM can understand how to use them better because there's less in the context, but it's still pretty obvious how to use a product tool with, CRUD operations in it. And this was actually one of the ML guys at GoDaddy, Ramji. He taught me this. It works really well.
Nice. Well, that'd be a good way to expose those atomic tools at one level, but then you also then expose your other behavioral tools. So think about products as another good example. Say you want to put you want to allow an agent to mark one of your products for on sale and adjust the price. Well, typically with a commerce API, that's not necessarily a trivial update. Depending on how the data is modeled, it could be, but you're updating the price of variants and SKUs as well, not just one product. So it just gets more complicated when you have variants and SKUs. Well, you could probably do that with a product update or a product tool with an update action that could do that, but you could also expose just update product to sale or put product on sale or something like that. That's a specific behavioral tool that performs a common but maybe more complex operation there. So you're still providing those atomic in that approach that you recommended, but then you're exposing more behavioral things as well to make it easier for an LLM to do that might be a complicated update on an entity or multiple entities or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
Cool.
Do you have anything more you want to add on tools, or should we move on?
I mean, I think we've covered it, a lot of it. And I think you need to think about tools just like you do for anything coding wise. You don't want to shove everything in there. You don't want you don't want the monster tools, just like you don't want monster React components, but you don't want tiny React components in your front end that do nothing too. It's that balance of finding the most useful approach for the business problem that you're trying to solve. And there's not going to be one answer for everyone, like we just saw. Talked about. You're just going to be finding the appropriate approach for the business problem that you're trying to solve that provides you the best solution and the outcome. But you just want to make sure each tool has a clear and distinct purpose, and that you're not muddying it up so that the LLM can fully understand what each tool is supposed to do and what the outcome of that tool should be so that it can properly call it according to what the user is trying to do.
Yeah, and so much is this is iterative, and it's also using evaluations and like we heard or read from Torsten Ball's article. Everything in the context window changes the output of everything else. So even if you add something completely unrelated in your context window, like a new tool or a document or something like that, it can totally change the outputs of everything, even unrelated to that. And so a lot of this is just okay, it's not calling this tool. I don't know why. I need to add in the system prompt more persuasive language for it to call this tool, or it's getting confused with this other instruction or something like that. And I've actually found it's helpful to copy and paste your LLM system prompt and maybe even tools also, if you're having these issues, into a different LLM and be hey, it's not calling this tool. I can't figure out why. Why is that? And it might be oh yeah, way back here, you kind of said this, and then down here you said this other thing, and those two things conflict. When things get really complicated, that helps.
No, I was chuckling here because it just made me feel I hopefully this is common for a lot of people. Back when I was learning to engineer, I feel like so many problems. I was just searching the code base, trying to find like missing semicolons or syntax things. And this was before Prettier and all that stuff, or like PHP, where it really mattered, where you had a proper ending semicolon and everything. And so like you're just hunting and pecking, trying to find that one place where you're missing something. And I feel like we've just traded problems now for LLMs, where we don't ever have to think about syntax anymore. We don't have to make sure that that semicolon's in the right spot, but we do have to hunt and peck to make sure that we're properly putting that one little string in the system prompt to make sure it knows that like this tool exists and this system prompt over here, and that it can properly hand it off to this other agent to knows that it's available over there. And so like we've just traded one set of problems for another set of problems to some degree. But yeah, I just felt
Yeah.
like when you're describing that of how I felt just looking and hunting for those tiny little errors that totally give you a white screen of death, and you're like, "What did I just do?" You know?
Yeah. And it's like we swapped deterministic problems for these probabilistic problems. So
Yeah,
yeah, now it's
I
like
don't know which
we,
one's better.
yeah, I know. It's like you could actually find and fix that semicolon issue, but now like why is my agent not calling this tool? That one's it's kind of harder to figure out because it's like subjective almost.
Yep, totally.
So, okay, before we wrap, I wanted to share. I have one hot take that got a little bit of traction on LinkedIn. I wanted your take on this. So, my hot take was that personal software is not going to be a big AI story. I said there's no way you'll want to use your sloppy AI generated workflow instead of meticulously crafted code constantly being improved by open source maintainers. Throwaway scripts and just for fun apps, sure, but not anything you rely on heavily and has real consequences when it doesn't work. So there was some good comments on this, and some people kind of giving examples of stuff, but I still stand by this. And actually, one of the comments was, "Hey, tell me about the buy versus build conversation because that's changed dramatically." And I'm like, no, actually, I emphatically think it has not changed at all. I still think it is much better for companies to buy than build. Now probably the same or more than ever, because just because you can write a bunch of code really quickly does not mean that it's going to be something that's usable and maintainable and better than something open source or paid in the along the lines down the
I
line.
mean, I think it depends on what it is, right? And for a while, like NPM was inundated with just like tiny little helper libraries that everybody went to, or like country codes. Nobody wanted to write country codes or go and have to copy and paste stuff. So they're like, let's just pull in that NPM library that has country codes or like stuff like that. I think maybe open source libraries like that are gone because I'm just like, just tell an LLM to spit out the country codes, and like you're reducing supply chain attack effects by like not hopefully having as many dependencies. But I think you're right, for any software of substance, you're still going to want to trust a team behind it versus something that maybe you're doing quickly to get to a solution and you don't understand all the edge cases. Because hopefully, if a team is building something worthwhile, they're still thinking about it and building it well and thinking about the edge cases and like continuing to debug the issues that they're finding and working on it. Even if they're using LLMs to write all the code, I'm hoping that they're building top-notch quality software with LLMs. And I think I agree with you. You're not going to get that level of just something where you tell an LLM, okay, go build this thing that a team of 10 people are doing, right? And you just try to tell an LLM to go do it, and it won't be at that same level. For one, LLMs don't have taste. They don't have creativity that humans do to still design a really good API or something like that, right? And so I agree. And I've the side projects or the personal software that I've done, because I built some. I built like one for AWS logs. I hate logging into like 5 different AWS accounts to look at logs and stuff like that. So I built a little app that just allowed me to easily switch back and forth through it. And it was fun, but I used it for like a week. And I just haven't gone back to it. And it's not good enough to break the flows that I already have. And I think that will be the case, because I think to build things that are good enough to break flows and disrupt flows, you really got to put time and effort into it, even if you're using an LLM to write all the code.
Yeah, it's still really hard to build good software, even though an
Yep.
AI can spit out code quickly. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
No.
Maybe with, GPT 12 or whatever,
Maybe.
but it's just not this year.
Nope. Agreed.
Yeah.
But speaking of new models though, well, I guess GPT-12, but we are at Gemini 3. Have you played with it at all today?
No, but I'm hearing good things.
Me too.
AMP has
Yeah,
switched
I'm
over their
excited to.
default model to Gemini 3.
Yeah. So I'll use it by default, I guess.
Yeah,
But
me too.
yeah, the only thing, I don't know if it's a mental thing. I did one thing with it and I could tell it was Gemini 3 because I asked it a question about something I'm working on, and the response was not verbose enough. And I questioned it because there wasn't as much, it wasn't as verbose as what I was used to. And so that's probably more like just a mental expectation that I've gotten used to of how LLM's been talking to me, and it changed because now it's like a different person talking to you that's hopefully smarter and stuff like that, but I'm not used to it. So I was just like, that doesn't seem right. And I was like, well, that's kind of weird that I immediately just questioned it based on like the fact that it gave me 3 bullet points instead of like a whole paragraph of why it was saying that. So I don't know. It'll just be interesting. I think it's just gonna be
to just like you've
yeah,
been trained that there must be verbosity, otherwise it's like not true.
exactly. That's like if it doesn't say you're absolutely right, I don't trust it.
Yeah, there you go.
So yeah, there's Gemini 3, and then Google actually just released their own IDE too. What's it called? I wrote it down. Anti-gravity. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just another VS Code wrapper, but I think it's only Gemini models. They have Gemini Model 3 as their default, but then they also have, which maybe this is using Gemini 3 too, but they also have like a rush or a fast mode. So they basically differentiate plan and fast, where plan will like think a bit more and talk to you a bit more, and then fast just like goes and writes the code. So if you know exactly what you wanted to do, if you want to go say like change all the references from this name to this name, you could use fast to do that, and it won't like think about it. It'll just do it. So, I mean, could be cool, but nothing groundbreaking that I saw. And I don't know how much I want to be tied just to Gemini models in my IDE either. So I think I'll still stick to VS Code and AMP for now, but might play around with it some more.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for something that's going to materially change the way that I work or my productivity. And I don't think like a slightly better IDE is actually going to change much of anything for me.
No.
And I'm a little bit of a, I'm sure there's a better word for this, but like, I'm not trying new things because it just works so well to just talk with an LLM. It doesn't even matter the form. Even if you're in Claude Desktop or you're in AMP or Cursor or whatever, it just doesn't really matter. It's kind of all the same.
Yeah. And I mean, that even goes back to all the recommendations we talked about, like with context and watching a context window. Like ultimately, if you're just talking to it and creating new sessions or new threads with like new conversations, you're usually going to be okay. Like you don't need to like be overly meticulously aware of the context window to the point you're worrying about it, that you're not just getting your work done or actually making forward progress on it. Like I think you'll still gain just by using the LLM versus being overly worried about everything context wise.
Yeah, agreed. Cool. Well, I think we were absolutely right about all those points.
100%.
Nice. All right. Until next time. I'll talk to you later, Wes.
Yeah, man. See ya. Have a good one.